It is March 20th, 2025. And if you look at the Trump administration, specifically at Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, he's claiming that we are well on the road to ending the war in Ukraine, that we're going to see a full ceasefire in no time, and that these upcoming talks between the US and Russia, set to happen soon in Saudi Arabia, that those are just about hammering out the details. But is that actually the case? Because if you look at Russia, they've made it clear that they are incredibly wary about any kind of a Minsk 3 style agreement, right? They do not want a frozen conflict. They are paying attention not just to the US, but they're also paying attention to Europe, where you have people like British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron talking about plans to prepare thousands of troops to go into Ukraine as soon as there is some sort of ceasefire agreement. Which, if that were to happen, well, yes, Russia would be going along with the ceasefire. They would also be creating an additional problem for themselves, and that now they would be looking at a Ukraine where maybe there are thousands of European troops. Maybe Trump has taken over ownership of the power plants, as he is now apparently proposing to Zelensky. So, what is Russia going to do? What are they considering? And what could this mean for the conflict in Ukraine, as we see Trump trying to get out of it in a way, because he clearly wants to focus elsewhere with his eyes on the Middle East and then eventually on China? We got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Jim Jatras, a geopolitical analyst and a former U.S. diplomat. Jim, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Rachel, it's always a privilege to be with you. I really appreciate your having me on.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to you and to get your insight. And I'm curious what you're thinking about the latest talks between Trump and Putin, because as we know, they spoke on the phone this week again, and they agreed to a, shall we call it, a limited ceasefire, specifically on the targeting of energy infrastructure. Then you had Trump call Zelensky and essentially tell him what was going to happen, is kind of the gist of what I got from that phone call. But the White House seems to think that we are on the path to ending this war, that it's going to happen in no time. But if you look at what the Kremlin is saying and you look at what Putin is saying, they're pointing to the fact that they have a lot of preconditions, they have a lot of demands that need to be discussed. This is not going to end anytime soon. So, what is your take on the current situation?
Well, as we've discussed earlier, and based on the piece I wrote back in December, that it occurred to me that Trump was not going to take the opportunity to just sort of dump this thing early on, saying, "Hey, that was Biden's thing. I had nothing to do with it," which is not exactly true, and just sort of walk away. Instead, he's trying to be the big man, trying to be the problem solver, pretend that somehow this is, oh, you two boys are fighting, Zelensky and Putin. It's a Russia-Ukrainian war. I'm going to be the peacemaker here, even though Marco Rubio has admitted that this is a proxy war by NATO against Russia. He missed that opportunity. Early on, it seemed that they were going to follow the path of trying to normalize relations with Russia and then eventually move to discuss a big settlement in Ukraine, and only then talk about a ceasefire, which would be the logical sequence. And a lot of people, and, I'm not going to mention names because these are people I respect and friends of mine, but a lot of people were really getting high on hopium as far as I could see that, oh, yes, Trump is going to move to a realistic international policy. We're going to allow spheres of influence for Russia and China and go back to kind of a normal world from before 1914. It's pretty clear that that's not happening because we saw that with the rapid shift then just a couple of weeks ago to ceasefire. We want a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, which is just exactly what the Russians have said they will not accept because it would simply be another kind of Minsk type agreement that would not be honored by the Western powers, which is, by the way, what I said in December, exactly what they would end up trying to do. So that's where we are. And that's why we have two different conversations going on here now between Trump and Putin. Putin wants a global settlement. He wants a permanent peace. He wants to address all those European security concerns that were in those draft treaties in December of 2021. But you got Trump now saying, no, we want a ceasefire. We want an immediate end to the fighting, an immediate, so that we can get out of it. Now, as cleanly as possible, dump the whole responsibility for Ukraine over on the Europeans, and move off to the Middle East, where it looks like a big war is brewing. So that's why they're not having the same conversation. Now, I think Putin is trying to say, fine, we're not going to say no, but let's talk about the details, knowing that this ceasefire idea is not going to work. I don't know what Trump thinks he's trying to accomplish. He's still trying to get to a ceasefire. He's trying to, nudge Zelensky in this direction, nudge Trump in that direction. I don't think that's going to work. So I think we're starting to see an increasing incoherence to American policy.
Yeah, and it's been so interesting to watch as I feel like the version of Trump and his administration, to that extent that we get, changes based on the day, right? One day you have Trump calling out Zelensky publicly, telling him, look, Russia is winning this war. Russia has all of the cards. We need to make a deal and, get what we can get for Kiev before it's all said and done. And then the next day, exactly as you were noting, he's going to Putin saying, yeah, let's have a ceasefire. And Putin's sitting over there going, I don't know how many times I can tell you, we are not doing a Minsk style agreement. We're not doing this again. We've learned in the past, and now we're moving forward with that knowledge. So when it comes to the current statements that we're getting from the White House, which we're hearing from Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who interestingly has kind of become the guy who brokers all of the deals, right? He's the guy who Trump sends when he wants something done. Well, Witkoff is saying that there is a relatively short distance to go before a full Russia-Ukraine ceasefire is reached, saying, quote, I think the devil's in the details. We've got a team going to Saudi Arabia, and that we're going to figure out those details. But as you were noting there, Russia's been very clear about the details, right? Russia's been very clear about its demands. Putin has said it over and over again. So the way that the US is proceeding is like they're trying to back Russia into a corner, and they're trying to get Russia to basically say a flat out, no, we're not doing this. That way they can say, oh, Russia doesn't want a ceasefire. Is that how you see it, or is there more to it when it comes to Trump and his administration's approach?
I think that's basically it. I mean, Witkoff is Mr. Fix-It, right? He's the one who arranged the Gaza ceasefire, and now we see what a shambles that's in at the moment. And that's real. I think the real danger of a broader war right now. He's supposedly Mr. Magic then when it comes to a Ukrainian ceasefire. But at least if we go by what both sides are saying, they are very far apart. Even if this idea of an energy infrastructure moratorium on attacks on energy infrastructure, that doesn't seem to be holding up now. The Ukrainians are accusing the Russians of breaking it. It looks like the Ukrainians are themselves breaking that moratorium, and have the Ukrainians who informally agreed to that. Meanwhile, it looks like we have another new incursion, or at least attempted incursion, by the Ukrainians into Belgorod. So none of this bodes very well for an early ceasefire. Now, I would say that to the extent to which they have any cards at all in Washington, there is one, and that is it's clear that the Russians would prefer some kind of a diplomatic settlement to simply imposing a military solution. My personal opinion, I think that's a mistake on Moscow's part. In other words, if they consider an agreement by the West to be more certain than actually imposing their will by force, I think they're making a mistake because, and I'll say this very bluntly, no deal signed by anybody in Washington can be trusted ever, at least for the foreseeable future. It just can't. Even if Trump is entirely sincere, and maybe he is, the extent to which you can pin down what his sincere feelings are at the moment, you simply cannot trust that his administration would carry out his commitments, or certainly that any subsequent administration is. At best, you would get what amounts to another Minsk agreement, whether the Russians recognize it for that or not. For example, let me give an example. We've been hearing for weeks now about the Kursk situation, and that the Ukrainians were surrounded and they were either had to surrender or die. And you had Trump personally appeal to Mr. Putin to say, hey, don't kill them all. Let them live. And Putin responded, sure, if they lay down their arms, they will live and they'll be treated in accordance with the law. We haven't been hearing about that lately. I haven't seen any news of any mass surrenders, but a lot of news stories, which may be fake, by the way, that the Ukrainians are withdrawing. Did Moscow allow the Ukrainians to withdraw? Is that in fact happening? Is that some kind of goodwill gesture here? That's the kind of mistake I'm afraid Moscow, if that in fact happened, might be enticed into doing, thinking we can use that as a sweetener to get more out of Trump. Um, I think there is that reservoir still of goodwill in Moscow that wants to believe they can make a deal with these people, and I think that's a very dangerous road for them to go down. But that, I think, is where the American side will try to get a hook into their jaw and sort of draw them into what amounts to a ceasefire while pretending it's leading to a final settlement. So there's lots of room for deception to go on here from the Western side. The question is whether people in Moscow will fall for it. I think increasingly they will not, for the reasons that you stated, but we really don't know right yet. I think that's where the sort of the mutual attempts at deception are going on. I don't think so much deception on the part of Moscow, but to say, all right, you've given us a little something. Let's work out some more details, but we want to pull you into what amounts to a real settlement, which frankly, I don't think there can be.
Yeah, and that's a really, I think, important point to keep in mind there. And I'm with you. I haven't heard much on the situation in Kursk, and I was kind of in the same boat of wondering, okay, well, what's happening here? Because, yeah, the way that Zelensky was framing it was, oh, there is no encirclement, right? Everything's fine. Our troops are doing what they're supposed to do. Then you get these reports about saying, oh, they're withdrawing. And then, yeah, the question is, okay, what's actually happening? What is Moscow allowing, or what decisions are they making? Because every time that they decide that they're going to show a gesture of goodwill, thinking back to, early 2022 when they pulled back from Kiev, they said, hey, we've got a deal in Istanbul. We want this to move forward. It ends up backfiring on them. And another thing that we also have to take into account right now is what's happening over in Europe, because as we saw just last month, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he goes to meet with his European colleagues and he's saying, hey, we want you guys to focus on Russia. That way we can focus on, namely China, also notably the Middle East.
Yeah.
Well, right now what you have happening is that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says, okay, he creates this coalition of the willing, as he's calling it, and he's trying to figure out plans to send between 10,000 and 30,000 troops to Ukraine to help enforce a peace deal peace deal with Russia. But in reality, those troops would be sent against Russia. So that would be my major concern, is at the moment that you have any kind of ceasefire agreement, all of a sudden Europe starts flooding troops into Ukraine. And then Russia is left with this impossible decision of, okay, do we kill these guys? Do we break this ceasefire? Do we have an all-out World War III scenario? Or do we, try to trust the West when we know that we can't trust the West? How do you view the role that Europe is playing right now?
A lot of people have been, again, some of the ones who have been high on hopium, as I've been saying, are saying, oh, the Russians, the Americans are on the same wavelength, and they're both sort of pressuring the Europeans, and the Europeans are the odd man out. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think, look, both Starmer and Macron had very cordial meetings with Trump at the White House. They were not as stupid as Zelensky was during his meeting, and they didn't come to an agreement about backstopping a European mission in Ukraine. But if you look even at Hegseth's comments at the Munich Security Conference, he left that door open too and talked about, well, there could be European troops there, but they would not be covered by Article 5. Why would you need to say not covered by Article 5 unless you were envisioning a European force there? And again, I think this is more probably, again, leaving Mr. Trump aside, but people in his administration more intended a kind of a good cop, bad cop approach to Moscow. The Europeans will make a lot of noise and sound very militant, whereas Trump will sound very friendly. But what the game plan is, to the extent there is one, is if you get the Russians to agree to a truce, then the coalition of the willing puts some troops on the ground to enforce the truce or monitor the truce. And even though there's no formal American backing for that force, it does create exactly the dilemma you described for the Russians is, now what do we do? Because now there's a truce, supposedly there's a ceasefire, there's this European force coming in. We didn't agree to it, but now it's there. Are we going to attack it during what is now a ceasefire? And even though the Americans have not guaranteed the security of that force, it puts the Americans in a position where they'd have to back it up if the Russians attack them. So I think that's the kind of sort of dead cat they want to throw on the table to present to the Russians, which puts them in a very difficult position. Which is why, unless they've totally taken leave of their senses, they cannot agree to a ceasefire in any form.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see the way, and I on one hand I want to say, oh, the West, they still haven't learned their lesson, right? They're still trying to trick Russia into an agreement, but then on the other hand, if they do trick Russia into that agreement, well, then that's the West being successful, at least
Yeah.
in that aspect of it. Now, another part of this that I think is interesting is the fact that, when you look at what Russia has been saying, their security concerns, it all comes back to NATO, right? This NATO alliance ever expanding right up to their doorstep. They are worried about Article 5. But when you look at what the US and what Europe are doing right now, not only do they have Kiev so propped up that it may as well be a NATO member, but then you also have Trump in his call with Zelensky this week. He proposes that, the US should just take ownership of Ukraine's power plants to ensure their long-term security. So not even let's take control of these until the war ends. It's, hey, we're going to be taking control of these long term. And this, of course, comes after Trump's deal of wanting to gain access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals. All of these should be a big red flag to Russia, right? Exactly the opposite of what they've been saying. They don't want, increased US occupation control, whatever you want to call it, in Ukraine. So how do you view the fact that Trump is even bringing something like this up at this point?
I think you hit the nail on the head. This is exactly a kind of a backdoor security guarantee coming from the United States, from the European countries. Even if it's not NATO per se, it's still a guarantee of Ukraine's security by NATO countries. How is that any different? And so when you get into not only the question of what the territorial arrangements will be, but what is the status of any rump Ukrainian state? Does it have a security guarantee in effect from NATO? And can even any assurances about neutrality and denazification be trusted? Again, there are a lot of very smart, goodwill people out there saying, well, yes, as long as they repudiate NATO membership and Ukraine will be formally neutral, they'll put that in their constitution. The North Atlantic Council will agree to that, and so on and so forth. Then the war can be over. No, not at all. You can't trust that. You can't trust these people at all. And again, I don't, people have talked about an Austrian model or a Finnish model from the first Cold War with the Soviet Union. I don't think that'll work anymore. And like I said, I don't want to mention names, but one name of a guest you did have on recently, Mark Sloboda, is the only one I've heard saying this is, and I agree, I don't see how Russia can trust in any any guarantees about the future, let's say, non-hostile status of Ukraine, as long as there's still a Ukrainian state. In other words, as long as there's still a Ukrainian state that is not, let's put it bluntly, a Russian satellite, I don't see how they can trust the Western powers not to meddle in that state and build it up in effect as a hostile force, what amounts to a NATO cat's paw, even if it's not formally part of NATO. They'll find some backdoor way, whether it's putting Americans in for rare earths or energy infrastructure or some other form that doesn't to amount to the NATOizing of that state.
Yeah, and that's got to be the biggest concern, right, that Russia's dealing with right now. And then you bring in sort of the Trump aspect, whereas one day he's like, you know what, we're ready to be done with Ukraine. That's not our war. The next day he's like, let's take over the power plants, right? Let's do this and that and take their rare earth minerals. And it goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, which was this ceasefire in Gaza, right? Trump was supposed to be the champion of that. He was the guy who was going to bring peace to the Middle East this time around, for real, he said. But then we got those reports as we were getting into that ceasefire that what was actually happening behind the scenes was that Netanyahu was telling his far-right genocidal maniacs that we're not going to follow through with this deal to phase 3. The war is not going to be over. And Trump has told me that that's okay and that we can do that. And now what do we see? Israel back to bombing, back to reports that they're preparing a land invasion, and back to openly killing Palestinians and massacring Palestinian children. So if you're looking at someone like Trump with the statements that he's now making, not only openly bombing Yemen, but then threatening war with Iran. I mean, how do you see Trump and his position on the Middle East, but also how untrustworthy he appears to be from all of this flip flopping back and forth?
Well, again, at the risk of beating I hope, a live horse from back in December. As I said, yeah, that's the whole purpose of trying to come up with a truce in Ukraine, dump the responsibility on Europeans, so we can move on to what the fights we really want to have, which are first in the Middle East and then later on with China. And I think that's one of the things that's pointing to the increasing, let's say, time pressure on the American side to try to get the Russians to agree to something, because we've got big business looming now in the Middle East. Now, this truce in Gaza that Mr. Magic Witkoff came up with, I think was pretty clear from the beginning, was not going to hold for very long. That once phase one was finished and the Israelis got some of their hostages back, that there probably was little to no intention of the Israelis to honor any kind of phase two. So that's where we are now. But as you point out, this was always directed against Iran. And that's where you get to the Houthis coming in. We're going to bomb the Houthis. Predictably, that's not going to do any good. The Saudis bombed the bejeebers at them for years, and that didn't do any good. Biden bombed them, and now Trump is bombing them. And I don't think that's going to have an effect. And I think the Houthis, Ansar Allah, will, their proper name, will strike at the Israelis. They will strike against American ships. That there's a real vulnerability there. I mean, they've got some pretty powerful weapons that could do a lot of damage to us, including, what if they sink an aircraft carrier or something like that? We could easily find ourselves in a major war in the Middle East. I don't know if Trump is smart enough to avoid that. I don't even know how much, if he really understands the danger of what we could get sucked into in the Middle East, how much he owes to his various donors to get pulled into that. It's kind of sad, really, because a lot of people like me who supported Trump, wanted to believe that he would move to a more realistic policy, sees him going down the same old path that we've been going down for decades. And this could be the end of anything he wants to accomplish, domestically, in terms of making America great again and all that sort of thing, and shifting what should be a real focus, which is the security of our southern border.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch, as you're laying it out there, seeing what the Biden administration did, right? Because if we go back to when Biden was in office, he took these steps that had never been taken before, in the sense that the US decided we are going to force everyone else around the world to isolate Russia. We are going to destroy Russia's economy, right? We are going to ruin any chances that they have of achieving any military gains on the battlefield in the Donbass. And the US failed. They did not do that. They did not do it successfully. The rest of the world looked at the US and Europe and said, yeah, no, we're not doing that. We rely on Russia too much. And so now, thinking of the possibility of the Trump administration trying to wage a war against Iran. They seem to think that Iran is Iraq, Afghanistan, right? One of these other countries that they can meddle with. But not only is Iran not that, Iran also has big and powerful friends and allies. It's a member of the BRICS alliance, right? All of these other things. So what are your concerns about what Trump seems to have not learned from the Biden administration, when it seems like the lessons could be very clear? We could be going in an entirely different direction right now if he had just paid attention, assuming that he is fully capable and everything is, within his control.
Well, there's still this masters of the universe mentality in Washington. Of course, I don't think I'm revealing any state secret to note that Mr. Trump has a very strong ego. So that he probably thinks he just by the force of his personality, his will, he can make people dance to his tune. Look, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that Iran is a lot weaker than it appears, that maybe the sanctions have gutted out their economy, that people are, very difficult. That's what happened to Syria, for example. Syria had been starved because of the sanctions. Mr. Assad made the mistake of thinking he can patch things up with the other Arab states, and that he didn't really need to rely on the Russians and on the Iranians anymore. And look what happened to him. So, Mr. Pezeshkian was elected in Iran with the idea he was going to reach out to the West and try to patch things up with them. That's not going very well. I think they understand that their only real friends in the world are going to be the Russians and the Chinese, who I don't think they would necessarily go to war with the United States to defend Iran, but they would supply every support they can to Iran short of war, and the Iranians will fight. I'd have to assume that that would be a pretty tough nut for the Americans to crack. Again, maybe the Iranians are a lot weaker than they look, but I don't think that's likely to work. And again, this where it shows the futility of this kind of a American mentality that we can make everybody do what we want them to do. Oh, sure, we'll just come to a truce with the Russians in Ukraine, and that's a favor from us. So then they'll break off of their relations with the Iranians and with the Chinese. Yeah, I don't think the Russians are dumb enough to do that, and I don't think the Iranians or the Chinese are that dumb either, because the Chinese know that if they manage to split the Russians off or them from the Iranians, we're just trying to defeat them all in detail, and it's still the same hegemonistic policy coming from Washington. We're just shuffling the deck a little bit and trying to pursue it a little more intelligently than the Biden administration did.
Yeah, U.S. foreign policy just keeps on trucking right along. And yeah, that's my only hope, is that these countries around the world, whether that be Russia, China, Iran, that they're paying attention to everything that is said and kind of seeing the writing on the wall of, if you're not being targeted by Washington right now, you could very well be next or somewhere there on that list.
And the sad thing is, Rachel, is that, as an American, as a patriot, I want my country back. I want to see a strong America, and that's inconsistent with this global empire. As long as we keep pursuing this quest for global dominance, benevolent global hegemony, as Bill Kristol and Bobby Kagan put it back in the 90s, we're going to continue destroying this country, both internally and in terms of what our real security needs, which are right here on our own border, not in the Middle East or in Eastern Europe or the Western Pacific. And, again, that should be the promise that Trump is delivering to us. And so far, it doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, he's only 2 months in. I know we've still got a few years to go, but yeah, I'm very interested to see what direction he decides to proceed in, given everything that is happening right now. And as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Jim Jatras, a geopolitical analyst and former U.S. diplomat, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you so much.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.